Marshall Island, you're where we came from, the one who made us into the people that we are.
Yagwe, hello, and welcome to Ozarks RiMajel, a special KUAF Public Radio Listening Lab multimedia series about Marshall Islanders who are navigating new lives in Northwest Arkansas. I'm your host, April Brown, co-founder and COO of the nonprofit, the Marshallese Educational Initiative, or MEI, that's headquartered in Springdale, Arkansas. Our guest today is Benetick Kabua Maddison, the executive director of the Marshallese Educational Initiative. Benetick, you travel extensively, speaking to world leaders and NGOs about nuclear weapons disarmament and the devastating consequences of atomic and thermonuclear bomb tests the U.S. conducted during the early Cold War in the Marshall Islands. But first, Benetick, please describe your homeland and its location.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. The Marshall Islands are located about halfway between Hawaii and Australia in the North Central Pacific. Oftentimes, people will mistaken that to say it's in the South Pacific, but it's actually above the equator. The Marshall Islands, there are about 29 atolls, 5 islands, within a exclusive economic zone of 1 million square mile, so about the size of Kazakhstan or maybe the state of Alaska. So it's pretty much an ocean nation. The land is about 70 square miles, so about the size of Washington, D.C.
Now, your ancestors survived for millennia prior to colonial contact. Your homelands were first claimed by Spain around the 1600s, early 1600s, and then renamed by British Captain John William Marshall before being colonized by Germany and then Japan. Before colonization, what did your ancestors call your homelands, and explain that name's significance?
Yeah, so before they were called the Marshall Islands, they were actually called, and to this day we still refer to it as Island Gaynad. Island Gaynad has a very deep meaning, but if you were to break down the name, the traditional name of the islands, so the first 2 letters of Island, A-E, means ocean current. The last 3 letters, Lung, refers to the skies or the heavens. And then the next word is Kain. It comes from the word Kainakan, meaning vegetation, referring to the land. And then, of course, you have Ar, which means ours, referring to our responsibility for our islands. And so it's a holistic view of the Marshallese realm. It's not just the land, but also the ocean and the sky.
In 1944, U.S. military forces seized control from Japan during World War II, and soon after selected Bikini Atoll as a site for nuclear weapons tests. Could you tell us about the Bikini experience in those first years, and then what happened from 1946 to 1958?
Mm-hmm. So initially, in January of 1946, the United States had already designated Bikini Atoll as a nuclear testing site. But they sent over the U.S. Navy the following month to ask the Bikinian people if they could give up their homelands for nuclear weapons development. And knowing that the Bikinians were Christian, they used the Bible as a means to convince the population to give up their homelands. And so a few weeks after that visit, they were removed from their homelands. And then about a few months later, on July 1st of 1946, the first test was conducted at Bikini Atoll, codename Able.
So that's the first test, then in July, and they had a second test that same month. But then things sort of ramped up over the years, right?
Yeah, and so the second test also happened around the same month, Baker. And then later on, the United States began testing more powerful weapons, one of them being Castle Bravo, which was the largest device tested by the United States on March 1st of 1954 at Bikini Atoll. In total, about 67 large-scale nuclear weapons were tested in the Marshall Islands, which is equivalent to about 7,200 Hiroshima bombs. And of course, that resulted in environmental destruction, numerous health issues, including cancer, and then other health issues such as diabetes, which stems from the destruction of the lands, where then people have to depend on food that's imported from the outside world. Food that American doctors, are now telling our people not to eat because it contributes to diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, and other chronic illnesses that we collectively refer to as nuclear-related illnesses. And then, of course, communities are still displaced to this day. Migration started within the country, initially from the nuclear testing program, but now we have many Marshallese. About 2/3 of the Marshallese population in the world are living outside of the Marshall Islands today. Majority of them in the United States, and of course the largest concentration is here in Arkansas. And we will continue to see a larger number of Marshallese moving from not just from the islands, but also from other states. States that are expensive for many families. In this case, California, Hawaii, places where Marshallese first migrated to in the 80s.
All right. So you talked a little bit in detail about the health consequences, and I know when you discuss the ongoing consequences of the nuclear legacy, because the tests happen from 46 to 58, 67 nuclear tests. But you also talk about not just the biological, not just the health consequences, but also the ecological and cultural. Now, cultural will be land loss, right, because identity is tied to the land. Can you speak a little bit more to the ecological, the environmental impact?
Mm-hmm. In terms of the environmental impact, the fact that there's still nuclear waste in the Marshall Islands, the fact that the radiation is still there, and that in many of these places where people have been relocated from, you won't find people there living, residing there, enjoying life like they used to before the nuclear testing program. And then, of course, with the cultural impact, Bikinians were some of the finest navigators and canoe builders in the Marshall Islands. But over time, they have lost that aspect of the culture because they were removed from an environment that they knew for thousands of years to a small island that does not have a lagoon where people could fish and practice the different fishing methods, or where they could push their canoes into the lagoon to travel from one island to another. And so Kele is where the Bikinians were permanently relocated to. And as you know, others are on Edge in Madro, and in other places.
Right. And I think it's somewhat known about Runit Dome. Can you explain what that is and that impact?
So Runit Dome is located on Enewetak Atoll, which is one of the two places in the Marshall Islands used for nuclear weapons testing. And in the 70s, the United States sent 8,000 U.S. servicemen and non-servicemen as well to build or construct this nuclear waste site that is unfortunately leaking nuclear debris into the environment. This has been a concern for the Marshallese people for decades. And in fact, back in December of 2019, Congress instructed the Department of Energy to assess the dome. And a report came out in June of 2020, pretty much downplaying the concerns of the Marshallese and the reality of the dome. Scientists have warned the Marshall Islands that if the country were underwater due to rising sea level, the structure would break open and release all of its contents.
Right. And there are people that right now live just a few miles away, correct?
Right. There's a population of Enewetakis who live about 15 miles away from this structure, the Runit Dome. And they're there because, well, the U.S. told them it's safe for them to return. However, they cannot eat or drink anything from the land that's grown on the land or anything from the ocean.
Right. And I think that takes us back then to the U.S. government and some of the responsibility. So has the U.S. government provided adequate financial compensation to the Marshallese people for these kinds of damages over this more than a decade of weapons testing?
It has not. The United States has not provided adequate funding to address their ongoing nuclear legacy on Marshallese culture, health, and the environment. Obviously, these are ongoing issues. And as I stated earlier, we're dealing with nuclear waste. We're dealing with environmental problems. We're dealing with intergenerational health issues that will impact generations down the road. Communities are still displaced. And so, yeah, the nuclear legacy has yet to be addressed.
So back early on in the period of U.S. weapons testings, the United Nations designated the U.S. as trustee of the Marshall Islands, and then the U.S. held the Marshall Islands in this trusteeship from 1947 until 1986, when a compact of free association was signed. Now, in 1979, the Marshallese people wrote a constitution because they voted to be separate from the United States. So this compact that went into effect in 1986 was just renewed this year into 2024. So tell us about the compact and its importance to Marshallese migration and diaspora, and did it address the nuclear legacy?
Mm-hmm. So after we had declared ourselves an independent nation in 1979, the United States did not recognize our sovereignty, our independence. And it may have been out of fear that here is a new nation that we used for nuclear weapons testing a few decades ago, and the possibility of them suing us, I think that may have prompted them to say, okay, there needs to be an agreement between the United States and the Marshall Islands. And in this case, that's the Compact of Free Association. Now, the compact, it allows Marshallese to migrate here to the United States without a visa. And And in return, the United States has a U.S. military base on Kwajalein. And so it has military rights in the Marshall Islands. And in fact, when it comes to the defense of the country, that's the United States, the same country that used the Marshall Islands for nuclear weapons testing and refuses to address these ongoing issues from their program.
Right. And so still in 2024, the United States still denies responsibility. Is that correct?
That's correct. So the United States continues to deny their responsibility to their nuclear testing program. And then, we have yet to receive an official apology or an acknowledgement with serious actions to say that they'll address many of these ongoing problems.
Okay. So what does the compact do?
So the compact also provides economic assistance to the Marshall Islands. And then for those of us living here in the U.S., we're eligible for federal benefits, which were recently restored since 1996. And so while we are fortunate for that, it's unfortunate that it took that long to restore these benefits that we rightfully deserve.
Right, and we're originally in the first compact, and then because of legislation, they were basically written out of the law.
Yeah, and so we were kicked off of those in 96. But again, we have sacrificed so much. Our lands, our culture, and our bodies for the United States to be the powerful country that it is today. In fact, 55% of the total yield of all of the tests they've conducted since Trinity were in the Marshall Islands.
Right, and that's with 67 weapons versus the 900 that were tested within the United States, mostly underground. But I think that shows those are very large bombs that were detonated.
Yes.
Right, large tests. So let's talk just briefly about climate change. You mentioned the threat there with RUNET. But what are some of the other factors that the Marshallese people back in your homelands face?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's also issues such as like waterborne illnesses. So before the pandemic, there was dengue fever. And in fact, the Marshall Islands, if I can remember correctly, spend about 10% of their national budget to combat dengue fever in the Marshall Islands. And so, of course, with the increase of temperature and the world not addressing the climate crisis, we will see similar health issues in the future. And then, of course, there's also droughts, flooding that have become more extreme and intense these past few years. And again, these are issues that the Marshall Islands alone cannot address, similar to the nuclear legacy. After all, we emit a very small amount of the greenhouse gas, and yet we'll be one of the first to let's say lose our country to rising sea level. Right now we're dealing with climate change. It's not an issue that we will see tomorrow or next week or in the future. It's something that's happening now.
Right, and with the increased just the drastic changes in temperature, and so you've got the rising seas on one hand in some areas being affected by floods, and then other parts of the islands you have drought. And with the flooding comes saltwater inundation. So you can't grow crops because people talk about sea level rise and how the lands will become underwater. But the impact of these storms will make the islands uninhabitable because of that saltwater inundation, because you can't grow any crops.
Yes, and when people are not able to grow crops because of the climate crisis, then they have to then move to the two urban centers, which are Ibay or Medero, for opportunities. Otherwise, they will move to the States, like most Marshallese do.
Right, right. So you, in your speaking engagements and in writings, you often talk about wanting to see nuclear justice. So for you, what does nuclear justice mean?
I think first and foremost is an apology and an acknowledgement from the United States, but also environmental remediation, victims assistance, and then, of course, economic prosperity. Being able to have good paying jobs, lots of job opportunities, educational opportunities. Those are things that I also consider to be nuclear justice. And then, of course, in the efforts of the Marshallese Educational Initiative, trying to promote the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, so abolishing nuclear weapons. That too is also nuclear justice.
So tell us a little bit about the TPNW. So what is that exactly?
So the TPNW is an international treaty that's been supported now by, I believe, 97 countries. And the goal really is to provide assistance for victims of nuclear weapons testing, assistance for environmental remediation, and then, of course, international cooperation among countries to help nuclear-affected states or nuclear frontline communities. And then, of course, the ultimate goal of bringing an end to these weapons of mass destruction.
Right, right. And I know that you often talk about the Marshallese people being frontline. Is everyone nuclear affected?
I would say everyone is nuclear affected because all of us are affected by climate change. But when it comes to nuclear frontline, similar to climate frontline communities, we talk about communities whose lands were used for nuclear weapons testing or used for mining or milling for the development of these weapons. And so that's the difference between affected and frontline.
Right, because we know even with Trinity, that affected over a dozen states within the United States, and that's not really well known. So we're pretty much all nuclear affected. But frontline are those in which weapons testing occurred, or mining or milling is going on their lands. And where's mining and milling generally taking place?
I mean, so
lands?
we're looking at indigenous people, and then indigenous lands are being used or were used for nuclear weapons testing.
Right. Well, thank you, Benetick, for joining us today in the Listening Lab. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Marshall Island, you are my homeland. We won't forget you and all the things that we've been through.